Right, hello everyone, and thanks for coming to the second Popularizing Paleontology Workshop. Now, as a kind of a little background to this, a lot of you were here for the first one, but just to go over it initially, this is really the follow-up workshop to an initial event that we held back in September last year, which really grew from a sort of set of ideas I had, that I'm a historian of science working on the history of paleontology, but I was noticing a lot that there were lots of people working in the field of paleontology itself, in museums, in science communication, in sociology, and various other fields, who are all interested in complementary questions of really what is the public role of paleontology and broader understandings of life in the past, and how has this developed in public culture and in popular ideas, really from the last 200 years onwards, but particularly thinking about the way in which scientific discourse interacts with broader cultural questions and broader cultural issues. So I set up this workshop with some funding from the Arts and Humanities faculty here at King's to really bring together a group of paleontologists, historians of science, artists, science communicators, and museum people to sort of think about these questions and to work out whether there was enough common ground to lead to kind of interesting discussions and potentially beneficial results out of it. And I was very pleased and very kind of happy that it did actually seem to form into a kind of quite natural cross-disciplinary conversation. It was an event where it seemed like there were very, very strong common agendas. It was quite easy to work out a common way of talking between different fields and different approaches, and people broadly interested in quite similar things and quite similar issues. So the workshop went on for over 2 days, and all of the talks and all of the and some supplementary blog posts were put up on a website at poppalaeo.com, which has got about I think 2,500 visitors so far. So reasonably broad sort of reach since then. In terms of the kind of questions that I was thinking about for the initial workshop, and which we're going to carry on discussing today, is firstly thinking about interaction between public ideas and paleontological science, how this has worked potentially both in current contexts and also in historic contexts, and also how it doesn't. What kind of problems can there be in this sort of process? Another sort of set of agendas was thinking about how current ideas and practices in science communication and in discussing paleontology within the public arena have been or can be informed by the history of the discipline. Obviously, paleontology has been around for about 200 years now, and there has been this quite long tradition of both ideas from the past either surreptitiously feeding into public and scientific discourse, or actually being quite reflexively engaged with by working paleontologists and by museums and by organisations like that. And finally, a sort of supplementary and quite important other additional angle is sharing ideas and methods. So thinking about how practices of science communication and wider public discussions of scientific and cultural discourse can cross-fertilise well between humanities fields, between the public and heritage sector, and between science and science communication. So these are the sorts of initial sort of agendas. In terms of the kind of, I went over all the blog posts and all of the talks before this, and in terms of some of the interesting consolidated things that came out of the first workshop, the first that I thought was very interesting was the long duration of lots of issues and lots of concepts and lots of motifs within the public discussion of paleontology. And this could be in terms of methods and in terms of institutions, so things like museums and things like newspaper and magazine displays reflecting and developing on past ways of presenting the discipline, but also in terms of motifs and in terms of particular conventions around discussing and presenting either paleontology as a science or particular organisms. So we had Darren Naish, for example, talking about paleo memes and how the same kind of images of particular creatures get recapitulated and sort of repeated through long durations of time. Another really big issue which came out of a lot of the discussion is why has, and particularly over the past 100 years, the presentation of dinosaurs, and not just dinosaurs generally, but dinosaurs as these kind of snarling, monstrous creatures, why has that been such a prominent public sort of motif around the discipline? Where did this come from, and why has this been so extensive? And following on from this, how can we go beyond this, this sort of idea and this basic association that paleontology is primarily about dinosaurs and primarily about dinosaurs as spectacular, decontextualized monsters almost. So that was a big common underlying theme in a lot of the discussions, I thought. And finally, another big issue which came out in a lot of the discussions was the importance of visual media, the importance of display, and the importance of images as a field and as a kind of practice which really did link together both the more public dimensions, the more scientific work, and was a natural part of the interface between both the scientific research but also its wider discussion within public contexts. So these were some of the kind of big areas that I thought did come out very productively out of the discussion that we'll hopefully be discussing more of over the next couple of days. But what we also came up with in the final discussion, which I thought was quite important, was there were a few questions and a few areas which were sort of left hanging over the discussion. In the final hour, we had a general reflective talk between everyone, and we came up with what seemed to be some kind of common areas which were underlying and which we hadn't actually resolved and which we hadn't actually dealt with over the course of the previous 2 days. So this is setting up part of the agenda for the discussion for today. The first, and this was a really obvious one which I hadn't actually thought about implementing into the discussions, and probably quite a big omission, is this question of agenda, of why popularize paleontology in the first place? Like, what is the purpose of this? Why present it to wider public audiences? And the second point, which we can also discuss today, is this question of audience. So who does paleontology get presented to? And this is both in the current context and also in more historical context. So what have been the typical audiences for paleontological outreach and communication? And also, what audiences should we be trying to reach with paleontological outreach, and how? And what sort of techniques should we start adopting regarding this? Now, in relation to these two questions, I've got a few ideas which from my sort of historical perspective. In terms of the audience, I'm not going to talk too much about that because this is going to be a large part of the first session. But in terms of audiences, one of the primary sort of historic audiences for paleontological and evolutionary presentations have been sort of erudite adults. So adults who are interested in science, interested in the natural world, and interested in broad themes around development and around life. And you can see this really from almost the establishment of the discipline, where large institutions like the Natural History Museums in Paris and London would attract large audiences of often sort of middle class and educated individuals with the aim of fulfilling their curiosity and sort of improving themselves through engaging with the life of the past. But then obviously, as we move into the late 19th and early 20th century, then one of the stereotypical audiences for paleontological research, paleontological communication, and one of the big associations within the public mind is that paleontology is a science which is very often directed towards children, and this idea that it's associated with a particular age range. And this, I think, like the presentation of dinosaurs, is something which has a kind of particular historical moment. We're going to be talking about this a bit in the initial sessions tomorrow morning, but to me this seems like a development that starts happening towards the beginning of the 20th century, but then completely runs away with the public discussion of the discipline as we move later on. So that's just some initial ideas from me. In terms of the kind of agenda purpose, then there are a few sort of areas which did strike me as being important ways of engaging or kind of motivating paleontological popularization over the past 100 or so years. The first, and this came out here, and I think John's paper towards the end of the first session, the first day of the first workshop, is this question of sort of enlightenment and just presenting knowledge about the past as a good thing about itself. And so presenting these ideas as just a way of building the common store of human knowledge, engaging with big questions and big issues around life and development and so on. And so this has been, I think, quite a big motivation both historically and today, and is often sort of also associated quite with a sense of, I think, of obligation by the scientists themselves. And this is whether they're sort of publicly funded scientists who are relying on sort of public money to conduct their research, or if we're looking at earlier periods when scientists are often sort of gentlemen amateurs and so on, then this idea of kind of using science as a way of spreading knowledge and spreading improvement is quite a powerful one. However, then we have one of the kind of big cliches in paleontological popularization, which is that it acts, that paleontology as a subject acts as a sort of gateway drug into into sort of higher forms or other forms of scientific knowledge and scientific engagement, with this idea that you hook the public or you hook young people on dinosaurs or prehistoric creatures, and then they learn from there about evolution, about anatomy, and about wider aspects of the natural world. Now, this is an issue and is a topic that does get widely presented and is probably a bit problematic in itself. But one issue about this is that it's a very old idea. It does almost go back again to the foundation of the discipline. So here we have Richard Owen writing in the 1860s when he's developing his plans for the Natural History Museum in South Kensington, and he's writing, it's the common experience of officers of national museums that no specimens of natural history so much excite the interest and wonder of the public as these reconstructed skeletons of large extinct animals. So again, this idea that these are the showy centerpieces that you use to get people into your museum, and then you inculcate them with wider scientific ideas. So that has been quite a long-standing sort of concept. Another sort of issue, which is particularly true of a lot of 20th century paleontology, is this the sort of drive for money and profile. Now, obviously, I don't think anyone's ever gotten rich by being a paleontologist, but the sort of using the discipline and using the sort of public resonance of it as a way of both generating money for the research and also as a way of generating profile for particular scientists to become particularly public figures has also been quite a big driving force in these popularizing efforts. Last time we had Marco Tamburini, who was talking about how paleontology in Germany in the 1900s often drew off a drive for public sponsorship and a drive for kind of public funding. But you see this very, very dramatically in sort of early and mid 20th century developments in the United States. So if we think of the Central Asiatic expeditions organized by the AMNH into Mongolia under Roy Chapman Andrews, then these were basically constructed using a great deal of public subscription, basically in partnership with advertising agencies, with a great deal of sort of product placement going into the scientific papers, and really attempting to use the profile of the field and of this kind of particular style of adventurous field work as a way of generating money, generating profile, and generating funds in quite a calculated way. Beyond that, though, we also have other issues, particularly around education about the natural world and using paleontological ideas as a way of sort of educating broader public audiences about particular elements and particular fields and areas in natural history and biology and so on. And so last time we had Joe Kane, who was talking about Gaylord Simpson's book on horses, which came out in the early 1950s, and this was a book which was specifically constructed of using the horse, this very, very familiar, very, very well-known organism, to mid-20th century American audiences as a way of educating them about anatomy, about evolution, about taxonomy, about a whole range of things. And then if we think about more recent kind of presentations, then quite often, not actually as much as it used to be, but quite often in natural history programming, then there can often be this sort of underlying narrative and this underlying presentation of evolutionary history and paleontological finds feeding into broader understandings of the natural world. And one of the best examples of this is the velvet claw from the early 1990s, using using the evolutionary history of various carnivore groups as a way of presenting and as a way of describing and discussing them. Another issue and another area around the public discussion of paleontological discourse and paleontological ideas is to make a strong intervention in current debates and current controversial issues. So today, for example, in public discourse around climate change, around biodiversity, and around evolution more generally, then quite often paleontological motifs are brought in, both as a way of presenting, as presenting the science and as presenting the current, the sort of current issues and the current problems around these areas, but also potentially sort of recasting the debate slightly by putting things like climate change within a much longer geological time frame, and also really just emphasizing the sort of the diminishment of natural biodiversity in the world compared to, say, the Pleistocene and relatively recent periods of geological history. So this is something which does feed into a lot of agendas which I think think we'd all sort of get on board with. But then, with my historian's hat on, then I'm always a bit, I can be sometimes uneasy with this, because there is a sort of darker side to this paleontological engagement with public debates. And if you look at, say, early 20th century presentations of a lot of paleontology, quite often it's very much using the discipline to intervene in things like ideas of civilizational progress. It's very often feeding into the early eugenics movement, into early racial science and things like that. So there is this sort of darker side to all this, which hasn't completely gone away, or maybe we may be seeing a resurgence of this at the moment if we look at how genetic sciences, and particularly human genetics, is being sort of misused and misapplied by the alt-right and by people like this. So we do have this sort of this continuation of this occurring. But one of the more sort of interesting ways, which I thought came out of a lot of the discussions from last time, was the way in which the sort of motivation and the course of presenting paleontology within public contexts actually serves as a way of feeding back into or developing the science itself. So we had, for example, Ilya Nurland, who was talking about the various controversies around the reconstruction of the posture of Diplodocus carnegii in 1900s Germany, and talking about how this was something that was, on the one hand, being a debate which was being conducted in the scientific periodicals, but also was being conducted in the wider public discourse, and these were working quite strongly in synergy. And then we also had Mark Whitten, who was talking about the changing representation of Asdarchid pterosaurs in both the public and the scientific media across the last 20 or 30 years, and how the popular presentation of these creatures and the scientific research very much went hand in hand to make these into increasingly sort of iconic organisms within the science. So these are some sort of general ideas that I've been having, and I'm sure we'll kind of be talking more broadly along this later throughout the next few days. But this is the sort of agenda that we've got. So in terms of our roadmap, for the first session today, immediately after this, we'll be talking more directly about this concept of agendas and working out the purpose and the sort of implications of these varying drives towards discussing paleontology within public contexts. We'll then move on to talk about art and paleontology, both in a historical context, looking at the mid-20th century, but also looking at the modern context. Then we're going to be doing something a bit different to what we did last time, in that we're actually going to have a public engagement component within the workshop itself, where we'll be having a pop-up exhibition of paleontological art, which will be on the second floor of this building from 6 o'clock till 8 o'clock, and this will be accompanied by talks by the various artists who are exhibiting at the event. And then tomorrow we're working through a variety of different angles. So firstly, we're looking at paleontology and children in history, so thinking about how this link gets established at various different times. Then we'll be talking about paleontological working with the media, either in terms of TV or in terms of new digital media. And then finally we'll be talking about more broader issues around communicating the science more generally. Okay, so that's more or less what we'll be doing, and thanks everyone. Okay.